And welcome back to the Beyond Clean Expert Series. This is the Chemical Monitoring Expert Series with our local chemical monitoring expert, Alex Hilliker. Alex, welcome back to the show. Always good to talk with you.
We're back, Bobby. Good to be here.
All right, all right. Well, this is a fun episode. I feel like we're getting down to brass tacks here, Alex, because throughout the course of the series, we've talked a lot about different chemicals, different hazardous chemicals, the risk of exposure out there, exposure limits. We've talked a little bit just in terms of education and regulations and standards. And I imagine if folks have watched all of those episodes, they probably, like I am, are sitting here convinced that that chemical monitoring should probably happen, or at least it's a good idea. I'd like to answer the now what question today if we can. So, all right. So chemical monitoring is important. Now what? Like, what kind of options does a department have in front of them if they choose to do chemical monitoring in their department?
Yeah, great question. I'm glad we're at this point in this series. And I'll say up front that any monitoring is good monitoring because it shows that you, to your point, Bobby, it shows that you understand the potential health impacts of overexposure to these chemicals that are being used every day in the department. So with that said, there's a few different options. The first, and I would say probably by far the most popular, is badge monitoring. That's the little badge, just like it sounds, that you put on your scrubs and wear throughout the course of your shift. One day a year or one day a quarter. And you send that off to a lab at the end of your shift, or your manager does. And then you get a report talking about what levels of chemical, in this case, probably hydrogen peroxide, you were exposed to or your team member was exposed to. And as with any of these options, there's going to be pros and cons. The most obvious pros for badge monitoring, of course, you're getting a true personal breathing zone measurement because you're wearing a badge right there on your lapel. It's very close to your nose and mouth. If the badge picks it up, you were probably breathing it in. You're also getting a really high degree of accuracy because these badges are being analyzed in the lab to very accurate standards and couldn't be easier to use. The downsides to badge monitoring, of course, up front, it's retroactive. You're getting notified after the fact of what you or your team member was exposed to. Which my argument would be that's not ideal, but good for routine testing, but not ideal.
Right, you get a notice in the mail that says, "Hey, last week you were exposed," and it's like, okay, what am I supposed to do with that? Yeah.
Right, now what?
Yeah.
And kind of similar to that, it doesn't account for those repeat acute exposures we were talking about in a previous episode with Dr. Salgo from ASP, and it's only representative of that one day, a year or one day a quarter, for example.
Yeah. You said that's the most common method. I haven't seen badge monitoring in a department. It might just be, my little myopic slice of SPD that I've seen. Badge monitoring. How common is that? And for the folks who are doing it, is that like an everyday thing or once a quarter kind of thing? How are people using these?
Yeah, it's typically a once a quarter or maybe a couple times a year type of exercise, and it's something that you may not even notice, right? Because we asked Bob or Sally to wear that for the day, and if there's no readings that come back, it's not necessarily something that needs to be talked about.
Right. Yeah. No news is good news. Okay.
Right.
What other options are there out there besides badge monitoring?
Yeah, so there is annual industrial hygienist IH testing. That's typically where you bring the hospital IH into the department. You could do this routine. You could do it when you buy a new sterilizer or a new AER. Let's get a real-time view of what's going on. Make sure everything is safe as we start up a new system, for example, or just to perform those annual checks. You're going to get a high degree of accuracy with that equipment most of the time. The challenges, of course, are that's also just one day out of the year typically that hospitals are doing that. And that brings us to kind of the third option, which of course I'm going to recommend at the Chemical Monitoring Expert Series, as it were, and that's continuous monitoring. So that's going to give you a real-time reading, as we've discussed. It's going to help you understand your short-term exposure limits, your permissible exposure limits for an 8-hour time-weighted average, and then log all of that information so that you can use that data to improve the workflow in your department.
Yeah, it makes sense. And on a previous episode, Alex, you talked about how these equipment manufacturers, these sterilizer manufacturers, care about safety, and they design these machines
Absolutely.
to operate safely within kind of the normal routine use. I could imagine, every now and then badge monitoring, or every now and then the industrial monitoring of these would give you a good picture of what happens on a routine basis. But I could see continuous monitoring having some value just because it never shuts off. Like if you have an event that happens on day 200 out of the year, it'll pick that up, whereas you might not if you didn't get lucky enough to be monitoring on the one day that you had some kind of equipment failure as well.
Yeah, no doubt.
So, if continuous monitoring ends up being what people are persuaded of, as is recommended in the standards that we talked through in previous episodes, and as you're recommending as the most favorable of all the monitoring options that you have out there, if somebody decided to do that, that they bought one, it's showed up in a little cardboard box on the manager's doorstep, and they want to put it in the department. Any advice out there for how to implement that well, or how do they get started?
Yeah, great question. And typically what we say is we want to remind folks that these are area monitors. They're meant to be representative of what people working in that part of the department could be exposed to or are exposed to during their daily tasks. And so typically what we recommend is a 1-to-1 ratio. If you've got 2 hydrogen peroxide sterilizers in your department, you should have a sensor and a monitor that's associated with each one. And those sensors should be placed in the breathing zone near the source. So on top of the sterilizer, or even mounted right on the front of the door, if that's something that's feasible for the department. The other piece that continuous monitoring can afford to departments is remote display capability. So putting a remote display outside the door to the department or the GI lab, so that if there were to be an event, a leak, a spill, that before you walk in, and you can really mitigate exposure in that way.
Yeah, you could get that "please don't open this door" alarm going on.
That's
So
right.
I can see the sense in that. That does bring up a good question in terms of team members seeing this monitor and being able to interpret meaning out of it. Because I could see somebody plugging one of these in, putting a monitor in, it displays a number, and the team members are all looking at it and saying, "Okay, there's a random number next to the sterilizer now." It's like, what do I do with that? How do I interpret this information? So, any advice on on training, or how to help team members do something actionable using this monitor and that data?
Absolutely. Yeah. Most monitoring companies like ChemDAC, we try to make it easy to understand. Good old fashioned color coding, for example. Green is good. But helping people understand what are the permissible exposure limits. We've talked about those at length in previous episodes of this expert series. I know that gas monitoring companies, chemical monitoring companies offer training regularly to hospital staff so that these numbers are understood. But also, I think it's important that when people do see a reading on the monitor, to take note of what's happening at that time. Are we opening a sterilizer door? Do we have multiple sterilizers in a row running at the same time? What are we changing the chemicals in the AER? It's important to take note of that, because that can inform changes and decisions that you make in terms of ventilation, sterilization technologies, and safety protocols. So it's really all about just giving you the data and information to improve that workflow and safety in your department.
Yeah, really well said. Gives us some information to fight back with. If that's what's causing the exposures, don't do that anymore. Don't run all the sterilizers at the same time. Well, I've got plenty more questions of what that looks like, but we are out of time. That's going to do it for today's episode. Alex, I look forward to diving deeper into this topic with you in future episodes. Thanks again for sharing your expertise with us. We'll wrap this and leave you as we always do here at Beyond Clean, and remind you to keep fighting dirty. See you next time.